us this Sunday afternoon. Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you so much to our guest, Andrew, for being here. So I'm going to get started and I will introduce our guest. Okay. So as I said, welcome to this Sunday's Layers of Design episode. Before we begin, just a few things. So this episode is going to be recorded. To stay updated with all of our events or any other new episode coming out, please visit layersofdesign.online. If you have any questions, you can leave them in the chat box and we'll be sure to get to them at the end of the session. When you're done with your sketches, it will be awesome if you can put them on Instagram and tag us at layersofdesign_ or use our hashtag #layersofsketches. Please connect with us on Instagram, Twitter, and Pinterest. And most of all, check out all of our episodes on Spotify, Apple Music, Google Podcast, and so much more. Okay, so this is the Sketch It Out episode, which is a new series hosted by Layers of Design. And we have the pleasure of having a conversation today with Andrew Aquart. So a bit about Andrew. He is a licensed architect and he's a project manager at Brilhart Architecture. We had our first conversation last week and it was just great to know, just get to know a bit about Andrew. And it's very inspiring talking to him. And he is very knowledgeable. So I'm really excited for us to get into this topic. So welcome, Andrew. Thank you for coming on.
Thank you for having me. I'm really excited too. Thanks for the introduction.
Of course. So before we get started into our conversation, can you just tell us a bit about yourself? Like what got you into architecture?
Sure. I don't know how unique of a story it is, but I didn't really know what I wanted to do until very late into high school. In people that I've encountered who went into architecture, they seemed to know a little earlier than I did, but I just didn't know what I wanted to do. I mean, we kind of talked about this, but I always loved to draw. Mm-hmm. I always loved art, but I would never call myself an artist by any measure. I just liked it. And in terms of schooling, I enjoyed things like maths and sciences, but again, I would never have told anyone that I was proficient at either. So I didn't really know where I was going to fall. And friends that I grew up with and my brother, we all did, for example, I was in a speech and debate league with my brother and some friends, and a lot of them wanted to go into law. And so for a while in high school, I thought, well, maybe I'll just do that. But it didn't fit. I did not feel right. And everyone else did. My brother is a lawyer, I have another friend who's a lawyer. And then my dad is a mechanical engineer. And I said, well, maybe I'll just do that. But once I learned how intense the math was going to be from mechanical engineering, I said, well, it's not that. No way. And then I have another good friend who did mechanical engineering and it worked for him. So in high school, I think it was my junior year, and I don't even remember what brought it on, but I signed up for a drafting class. It was like Drawing 101 at Miami-Dade College.
Okay.
I was in high school, but I was homeschooled, so I could take dual enrollment classes at a community college. And just the light bulb went off when I took that class. I said, it just felt like a perfect fit. So I said, okay, well, let's lean into this, see if it's real. I think the next semester I took an architectural history course, and the passion and the love and the interest just literally grew upward from that moment. Mm-hmm. Continually. Wow. But I did till now.
So what would you say you love most about the profession? Like, what was it in history class that just sparked that light bulb?
You know, I don't know if I have been able to put words to it, but it just felt like the proper place for me. I just felt, you know, when you feel passionate about something and you love something, it just feels right. Mm-hmm. And I was naturally interested in learning about structure, learning how the world worked and operated, the environment that I live in, how I could learn how to see it and analyze it and feel it in a way where I had knowledge of the world around me. I think that might be it more than anything. I had this growing interest of just understanding the world through my environment, and architecture gave me language to kind of understand that.
Oh, wow. That makes sense. That's awesome. Okay, so we're going to move. I have a bunch more questions for you, but we're going to start, discussing our topic. So our topic for today is living with environmental intuition. Right. So, and Andrew actually chose this topic. So can you tell us why this topic?
Sure. When you asked me to do this this sketch series and find a topic, I didn't really know how to put words to it. So I'm glad you forced me to put words to it. But essentially, environmental intuition, the way that maybe we can talk about it today, and it probably means a lot of different things to a lot of different people, but the way that I was thinking of it was environment being the environment with a capital E, your both cultural and physical environment. So beyond maybe how we as architects and how other people in different career paths and just life experiences and worldviews might view environment, some people might, the first word comes to mind, maybe sustainability, maybe it's weather, climate, being green, being sustainable. I try to get to a deeper and also broader understanding of it just being an all-encompassing environment, how we're affected by the world around us. So I think of it as cultural environment, and also physical, being climate, weather, and built environment. And then intuition, I chose the word intuition because I wanted to make the distinction between viewing the environment through a very academic and analytical mind versus something that feels more natural and guttural. And intuition was the word that I landed on because it is on the flip side, you have more of a conscious reasoning. So an intuition is something that is more deeply founded in how we experience the world, not so much as a professional, how we're taught to see the world.
Yes, and honestly, I really when I read the topic, when you sent it, I really like this topic because just like you said, it's so much more when we're talking about environment and architecture, it's so much more than just the sustainable aspect. We have to think about all of the other things that make up the world around us. And I feel like a lot of designers too, again, we are taught a certain thing. And like a lot of times we are taught also about the sustainability. That's what we're really heavy on. But then, just taking into the cultural context, that's really beautiful. So can you also tell us why you chose this building? And we can start sketching the building actually.
Sure. Yeah, so for those of you who don't know, the Barnacle House, it exists today. Well, so this house is called the Barnacle House. It was built by Ralph Monroe. I don't remember the exact day, but it was in the late 1800s, I think, the exact year. Very early down here in Miami, Florida, in the Coconut Grove neighborhood. And the building does exist today, but not as you see it here. Today, it's 2 stories. It has different pieces that were built onto it. And there's a boathouse at the end of the property. It's right on Biscayne Bay. A couple hundred feet from the bay is where the house is. But I chose this house in particular because it speaks to me in terms of fitting into its environment in a way that was unique. I think even at the time reading about it, and especially today, just the way that it was cited, the way that it functioned, and I also think it just looks really cool. I really love the building. I'm kind of infatuated with it, especially at this frozen point in history. This was the house as it was initially designed and built, and that's why I wanted to draw it.
That's great. So after you sent me the picture, I actually went and did some research on the building, and it's such an interesting house. And like you said, it doesn't look the same way it did like in this image. So when I was looking at more recent pictures, it has a first floor.
Yeah.
And it's very interesting when because I think the first floor rather, the first floor came about after Ralph he had mentioned that he had kids, and then he had a wife, and then he had kids, and then his sister-in-law came to live with them, and he noticed his house was growing, like his family was growing, but he really loved the roof of this house. And that's something we had also mentioned the last time we spoke about the roof, which I also, I would love for you to touch on the roof design. So he had mentioned that he really loved the roof design of the house, and he didn't want to create a second floor above it. So they actually raised the house to put the first floor underneath, which I thought was really cool. Like,
Yeah,
it's like
fantastic.
backwards.
It's so fantastic, and there are photos of the house going through that phase of where it's being lifted and then built underneath. Yeah, that the roof is so interesting. So that cupola, I guess if you want to call it, at the top, where all the yeah, exactly. There is a pulley system inside that can open hatches on that point to allow the hot air to escape the building, because the hot air rises and it's so hot out there that he gave his house a chance to be a little cooler than it would otherwise be, to allow some of that hot air and the breezes from the bay to pass through and the hot air to rise and come out, while the cool air would breeze by them below.
Wow. Yeah. The design is actually pretty cool, and the detail. I have to drive by someday.
Yeah, it's not, I have never been on an off day when they're not doing an event where it's packed. There's usually at the most ever one or two other people there.
Oh, nice.
It's very hidden, because the house was built in a time where the front door there, the front porch faces the bay, because it was at a time where that was, Miami was all about the bay. Someone asked the name of so it was Ralph Monroe who built the house.
Yes.
Yeah, Ralph Monroe.
I actually uploaded, let me just get it real quick. But yeah, so I actually uploaded some information on it.
Yeah, I saw on the Instagram, yeah.
Yes, over the weekend. So just really quickly. So yes, it's by Ralph Monroe, and it's the Barnacle House in Miami. It was built in 1891.
There you
go. Okay, so now I want you to tell me, so you're into architecture, right? And how was your education process? Like getting into school, how was the school process and all of that?
So I went to the University of Miami, and I should say before I really felt that architecture was the path for me, but what really solidified it for me is I took a summer program, I think at the end of my senior year, at the University of Miami. I think it was 3 weeks where I stayed on campus, and they put you through the rigor of design studio.
Wow.
Yeah, and I loved it. I loved just staying in studio all the time, being with a community of other people who also wanted to do something similar to you. I hadn't experienced that before up to that point. And it was just, that solidified it. And then I still probably didn't have enough confidence in myself that I was gonna be able to do architecture. I don't know if I just thought that low of myself at the time. But when I applied to colleges, I applied to schools for either architecture and civil engineering. I'm really glad that I took the route of architecture. I mean, I don't really know what I was thinking, civil engineering, but yeah, I applied and I got into University of Miami with a partial scholarship,
Nice.
which was what I needed to be able to go there. And I again, like, of course there were probably moments where I was frustrated, but I can't tell you a lasting moment where I didn't feel like I was in the right place. I loved the studio environment that I got at the University of Miami. I was really fortunate to encounter a lot of great faculty. The great thing about the University of Miami at the time when I was there, which is all I can really speak to, is the faculty was extremely diverse. So depending on the faculty members you got during your time there, your experience could have been just dramatically different. And I was very fortunate to, I studied abroad in Rome one of my last semesters, and one of the faculty members there is Jacob Brillhart. He's the, who founded this company, Brillhart Architecture, that I've been with for, I don't know, 7 years now. And just the summer after, he asked me if I was busy, if I wanted some work. At the time, he was just doing things by himself, and he thought he might have had a project where he could use a student to help him do some drawings. I said, sure, yeah, I'll help you out. And then from that moment in 2013, I haven't stopped working with him.
Wow, that's amazing.
It was just I was so fortunate to have had that encounter and had that experience, because the other thing that we actually talked about before, earlier in the week, is when I joined, by virtue of joining when it was just the two of us, and then his wife, Melissa Brillhart, also joined us at the same time that I joined, actually, because she was working somewhere else. It wasn't an office yet with a team of people and a culture. It was just individuals. So it gave me the opportunity to be part of the office beginning, which was so unique.
Yes. Wow, yes. And honestly, I would say that you're one of the lucky ones that was able to find that right, even just in school and then right afterwards.
Yeah, it's not lost on me on that. I'm very grateful for that.
And then how was the licensure process? So you're fresh out of school. Did you decide to get your license right after? And how was that like working?
I did not get it right after. I didn't. I honestly, when I came out of school, I thought maybe I'd go back after a couple of years.
For another degree?
Yeah, I thought I'd teach. I thought I loved the seeing professors and faculty members who were adjunct faculty who both had a professional practice and were teaching. I loved that aspect of having the experience of being in academia and imparting knowledge to students and gaining knowledge from students and faculty members, but also being in the world of having to solve real problems. So like I mentioned, it was so early on in our office that we didn't know how the office was going to grow. So I didn't expect to be here as long as I have been, because we were so young and it wasn't quite as established as we are now. So I really thought that I'd go back to school, and a lot of my friends who graduated with me had a similar path and ended up doing that. So I didn't jump into getting my license right away, and the office just got busier and busier, and we just kept growing and growing, and it got to a point where we were selected as a finalist for the MoMA PS1 competition.
That's awesome.
And just being out there, the office kept growing, and I said, well, I kind of like what we're doing now. Why would I leave? Why am I going to force something? So I was already very busy and I was doing interesting work. But then it got to a point where I realized that I needed where I felt that I needed to access, whether it's more knowledge or just another tier of being able to carry out the things that I wanted to carry out in terms of being an architect. And I felt like licensure was that path. And I think it was maybe 3 years after I graduated is maybe when I started.
And okay, so what do you see the value in getting your license?
Yes. The short answer to that question is yes.
Okay.
I know so much more now, and just in terms of knowledge that has translated to intuition, really, that I would say absolutely there's value there. In the moment, there are so many different things you can feel, especially when studying, and the information and the amount of information you're told you need to know can be so oppressive and overwhelming. But I have to say that the level of knowledge that's required to get your license, that I pull from day to day, being a practicing architect, there is 100% value to it.
Oh. So in your structure, I just want to know a bit more of like your work and your work environment.
Sure.
So how do you go about like your day, or when a new project comes into the office?
So when a new project comes into the office, well, I'll start by saying we have a very, how do I say it, controlled office size.
Okay.
I already alluded to the fact that we started off very small. We've remained a very tight group, and that has led to an incredible amount of collaboration and communal work. There's really nothing that we do in the office that everybody doesn't touch. On some level, every member of our office is involved in every project. Nice. There will always be a project here or there that someone works on less than the other person, but just the nature of our office, we're very collaborative. We know each other really well. We know how we work together. And so when a new project comes in, and the variety of projects changes how we approach it, but to speak generally, we typically like to get a handle on the person, okay, and the place where this project will be before we really conjure up any sort of formal architectural idea. We believe in this, that all of the projects we do are so tied to the user and the place, so integrally, which goes back to this idea of the environmental intuition. I think hand in hand with that is just understanding the people and the place that you're designing for. We usually start there. And it can be as simple as, if it's a single family home, which is a lot of what we do, it's as simple as just getting a list of wants from the client, and oftentimes a meeting with them so we can get a read on their personality, a read on what they like, what they don't like, and where they're from and how that might influence what they want. And then obviously the context of the place. If it's possible, we always start with a site visit. And it's usually a site visit with the client. And that's so critical because we can not just observe the site, but how the client interacts with the site to understand why they want to do a project. What are their motivations?
That's very interesting. So can you give me an example of what you think a well-designed environment is or will be?
Yeah, so like a concrete example.
Or one that's not concrete.
Well, I mean, this building in particular, the Barnacle House, to me is a prime example of a good architecture for its environment and the people who are using it. in particular with this house, I don't remember exactly how far away it's set back from the bay, but it's a couple 100 feet away, I think, at least.
Okay.
Which intuitively they knew, okay, we're in South Florida, we're on the bay, we're going to get heavy storms. They knew about hurricanes. They knew how deadly these storms could be. So I think right away, just in terms of orienting themselves on the site, they said, well, yeah, we can't have our house right on the bay, which is actually just completely opposite from what people want to do today.
Yes.
Technology and modernism and industrialization has brought along all these opportunities for us to be able to build closer to
The water.
compromising areas. You know, the concrete 5,000 psi, you can, you know, heavy reinforcement, you can get hurricane impact windows, all of these technologies that are fantastic, that are advancements in building. I think when not used in conjunction with having an intuition about the environment you're in, can lead to, I don't want to, it's not really bad design, but I don't think it's the best design for the place. So it's actually a great juxtaposition. Right next door to the Barnacle House, right now in Coconut Grove, there's a new house that was built, I think, a few years ago now, and it's a beautiful home. It's an excellent design. I really actually love it. I think it's really attractive. But it's right on the water. And so you have this juxtaposition of where we are today in terms of what clients want and what we can build and what that allows us to do in terms of our environment versus how they had to build in order to work with their environment back in the 1800s. And it's clear as day. And, you know, even just the life of this building, how they, you know, Ralph came down, his family was whatever size it was. He said, okay, I can get away with a one-story house with X amount of bedrooms, wraparound porch. This is great. Family grows. You know what? I need more space. I love my roof. I'm not taking down my house. You know, I don't have a Home Depot down the street to just get a whole new house worth of lumber.
Yeah.
Let me just, you know what? Let me be creative. Let me work with what I have and let's put it on stilts and build another floor underneath. Like, building within what the environment was giving you, both in its what some might say the harsh realities of the environment, can lead to this creative architecture.
Definitely, I completely agree. And just talking about how the environment can influence the architecture of the place, it's very interesting to see how creative the creative solutions that people come up with to, you know, go with their environment. And it reminds me a lot of, you know, buildings at home, how creative people look for creative solutions just to adapt to the environment, because there's not, you know, maybe there's the technology necessarily isn't there. So just
Right.
those little creative solutions, it's pretty cool to
Yeah.
see.
It really is. And I think it speaks to the human intuition in terms of having to live in a particular environment.
Mm-hmm. It's like you
yeah.
understand the environment so well that then you find a way to accommodate your living situation to it.
Exactly. And I had this conversation with my wife earlier today, actually, in terms of intuition, where knowledge doesn't have to be at odds with intuition. So I do believe at a certain point in history, indigenous peoples had a connection to their environment, because there was a period of time where architecture wasn't a profession, but you still had civilization with functioning architecture. So I think that speaks to this sort of deep connection to our environment and how it can be expressed in how we live and operate. But we do live in a time where so many of us are transient. Very few of us, if maybe actually none of us here, are indigenous to this environment. Ralph Monroe wasn't even indigenous to South Florida. So, but knowledge of the environment can inform intuition. So you can learn intuition in that sense. If you understand the environment you're in and you internalize that information, you can then, when you're posed with a question of how you deal with something, you have this knowledge that can almost become reactionary or guttural or sensing. People use so many different words to say, I have a sense it should be like this or something like that. That can come from knowledge that you have intentionally sought and or experienced. Yeah.
That's so true. So would you say for as a young designer just starting out, like I'm a young designer just starting out my profession. So how would you
You're not a young designer until you're 50.
Okay.
You are a young designer until you're 50.
Okay. Well, I mean, I guess I'm still putting myself in that, young designer, like really in there because, I haven't gotten my license yet, still working on that.
Yeah.
So how would you say, thinking about a space or thinking about a site once we get a new project, how would you advise us to go about analyzing that site?
Well, the best advice I can give is, if possible, to go there. And as much as you possibly can, because we all have very hectic, busy schedules, is to try to take in what the site is giving you. Aside from a very academic response, just, how does it feel? What's the temperature? What's the elevation? What's around you? What's the foliage like? Just to get a sense for the area. And then very practically, depending on the type of project, there are real questions like, if this is a house, do I have a water supply? Where's my electrical coming from? How is this actually gonna operate? Who is it for? Where do we park? Like, those are real problems. And if not dealt with up front, they do become issues. Like, I'd love to not have to think about the where the power pole is, and if you have to extend the water line, or how much parking you have to account for. But we've encountered that before, where if I just were to fixate on how beautiful something could look, and I ignore some of these very practical questions, then it's just disaster down the line. But I would say, just from a perspective of understanding the site, is to just be able to sit with it and listen to it and feel it, to get a very broad understanding of where you are.
That's good. That's great advice. So first of all, how's your sketch coming along?
I have not started. I have not started. I had a feeling this would happen.
I know it's hard. Okay.
I'm a very like, when I draw, I zone out. So it's really, I figured this would happen. Have you started sketching?
I keep starting and stopping, but I'm slowly getting somewhere. I'm still like at the top part.
I started with my little vignette, because I wanted to, I do a little vignette to make sure that I at least attempt to get it to fit on my page.
Interesting.
And I get the proportions and the angles somewhat close, because I've done so many drawings before where I start at one end, and by the time I start filling things out, I'm off the page, and I'm like, oh, yeah. You gotta be kidding me. Yeah. So, and this is taught. I've been taught this, and I use it whenever I think about it, just to make sure I can get ahead of this.
Okay, so can you tell me some things that inspire your designs?
Oh boy, sure. Actually, a large element for myself in particular is authenticity, in a broad sense. And the way that usually manifests itself is that the structure of the building, the structural members and the structural materials end up being the aesthetic. So a lot of our architecture, the structure is exposed because we find beauty in the honesty and of the material itself. So if something is concrete, we say, you know, let it be concrete. Let people understand that this is a masonry building, that it's heavy, that it's sitting on the ground. Or if it's steel, let's show the steel so that we can see that it's light, that it's, you know, probably elevated. Or so oftentimes the structure ends up being the architecture in terms of the aesthetic. And that's a real driving force in terms of the design thinking.
Wow, that's very interesting. So I also wanted us to touch a bit about designing for the public, because I know that's something we talked about the last time we spoke, and about the importance of designing good structures or well-designed structures for the community. So what are your thoughts on that, actually?
Well, I think it's so important. In general, whenever I look at anything being built, and I mean, as architects, you can usually tell when an architect wasn't involved. It just pains me because I always think, man, what a missed opportunity for good design. Because I have this sense and this understanding that design is so impactful on our environment. Everybody interacts with buildings and with, you know, town planning. Every person, it doesn't matter who, interacts with that. So it's critical to give intentional thought to how it's designed and laid out. I just think it's so influential in people's lives, whether they notice it or not, that it's just so, in my opinion, so critical for it to be done intentionally and with, you know, purpose. Specifically with public buildings, you know, we don't get opportunities to do a lot of public work, but we have actually we're designers, we're consultants for the design for a public building for Dade County Parks. It's a big community center, and that's been a really interesting experience because we were brought in because there is this desire with Dade County Parks, at least as it was presented to us, to bring forward good design to the public. You know, and I think that is a fantastic initiative. It's a hard initiative to get people to buy into because I think, like we discussed, one of the biggest roadblocks I think we've encountered in general in terms of things that are done for the public is they have a real budget and they have a real timeline, and people can be really motivated by fear of not meeting those budgets and meeting those deadlines. In government, that's usually a very big thing. And oftentimes the way that plays out is designs that are unique, for lack of a better word, often come along with this stigma of being more expensive.
Yes.
And sometimes that's true. Sometimes breaking out of the norm is more expensive by virtue of it not having been done before.
Custom.
Right, exactly, custom. However, there are ways that good design can be incorporated into buildings with standard materials and with standard operations, but done in a way that is good design. So oftentimes there's a confusion between building something in a particular way and having it look like buildings that already exist versus using the same materials but just laying it out in a way that looks different. That can be scary to some people, but it doesn't have to be scary.
Exactly.
It can be done. I think this was proven in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. Like we said, a lot of the public buildings down here in Miami-Dade, 50s, 60s, and 70s, were influenced by an architectural movement, and most often referred to as tropical modernism. And actually, it's an interesting branch of modernism that speaks to this topic of environmental intuition, because modernism, in a very general sense, was this broad brush of architectural style applied to any environment, regardless of what was unique about that environment and that culture. I mean, there's definitely more nuance to it, and I love a lot of the work that came out of modernism for sure. But down here in South Florida, the way that it manifested itself was in tropical modernism, which attempted to take on some of the really beautiful tenets of modernism that came along with the innovations in construction, like the big sweeping expanses of glass, open plans, etc. But because of the harsh environment, it looked different, and it responded differently. It had overhangs. It was built off the ground. There were open breezeways to take advantage of
ventilation.
And so that architectural style of modernism and tropical modernism bled into the public buildings because it was popular at the time. So I think it's been proven that it can be done, where good design can influence public buildings in a way that is feasible for governments to take on. I think it just needs a group of people to buy into it and say, okay, we'll jump in and we'll try it out.
So that was actually going to be my next question. How do you think we can get people to buy into the idea of designing or of providing good design to public spaces?
Well, I think it's twofold. I think architects, I would make the claim that architects would be very open to doing that if they were approached with the opportunity to design public buildings in a way that, was good design, outside of just your standard 4-block walls with a single 6'8" door and like no windows, which is currently how a lot of the buildings operate.
So many of them.
But I honestly think it just takes some brave people. That's all. And I think we have them. That's usually, historically, that's what it takes. It takes people who can make decisions who are not the architects. It's the clients. That's in the history of architecture. You don't have the Farnsworth house without a client. You don't have a lot of these great buildings without the client at all. Very few, I should say, very few. It's very few.
Yeah.
Unless the client is the architect. That's usually the only other way. So I think it takes some people being willing to put themselves out there and take what might appear to be a risk, but
in the long term, it'll be worth it.
I would argue in the long term it's worth it, and history has proven that.
Definitely.
But I'm not in a position to make those decisions, so it's kind of easy for me to say that.
Exactly, that's true. Again, these are just what we perceive from the environment.
Yeah.
So where do you see, I guess, yourself in like 5 years, or where do you see the future of the design profession?
Oh boy, where do I see myself in 5 years? I see myself right here sketching the Barnacle.
Amazing. Okay.
No, I seriously do see myself here continuing to work. I just love doing it. Jake often talks about it like architecture can be a disease. And I feel like I have that disease. So I don't think I don't know what exactly I'll be doing in the world of architecture, but I think I'll be here. And then what was the second part of the question?
The profession itself. How do you see it evolving?
That's a good question. I don't know. If I try to look back on history to see how it has evolved, or maybe where it is right now, I think that there is a movement to, I think this topic of being, environmentally conscious, both not just in terms of being green and sustainable, but of a particular people group being represented in an accurate way
Mm-hmm.
the architecture speaking to the culture and the environment that it's within. I honestly see that movement continuing and just getting more traction. Because I think what you're seeing is a response to the, I don't know what to call it other than the broad brush of modernity.
Okay.
And the way that it has shaped our environment and our profession for 50 years or more, actually, in both the ways that it's benefited us in terms of great architecture and great analysis of our environment, but also in ways that maybe it has harmed communities that have taken it and taken elements of it that just erases cultural representation
Yes.
and response to this particular environment that a people group might belong to. So I think there's a movement to try to combine the ideas of, because we can't just throw everything away. I mean, people are,
Exactly.
air conditioning isn't evil. It's really not. I mean, there are days where the heat is just so brutal and air conditioning is a relief, but I do think we depend on it more than we need to. And we're conditioned to need it to be 75 degrees in our houses all the time, which I don't think is completely natural. Now, there are specific typologies that need that level of control. Like hospitals need controlled temperatures, museums need controlled temperatures. Like there are typologies that need control. I think where I see the profession is moving towards this this attempt to understand our built environment and adapt the technologies and the freedoms that comes with to our environment in a way that's responsible. That's where I at least hope we end up.
Definitely. I hope so too.
Yeah.
And when you were just talking, you touched on the erasure of a people.
Right.
And with growing cities and new developments, that is something that is becoming more prominent, where, a new site or a new client finds this site and they have the money to just completely tear down all of the history that was on the site. And it's becoming a problem because, again, you can't just erase, at least I don't think you should just be allowed to erase the history of a people.
Right.
So how can we begin to prevent that?
Well, I mean, it's difficult. So I think on the one hand, it's individuals. There's a very individual responsibility to that. So in particular with the Barnacle House, the Monroe family was offered a lot of money by developers to sell the land so that they could develop it. And they wanted to upzone it. And they said no. They understood the integrity of being able to hold on to history. And it was their family's home. I think at the time it was Ralph's daughter, daughter-in-law, and two grandsons were instrumental in keeping the land and they sold it to the state so that it could be kept for posterity so that people could do what we're doing. Well, we could still draw this, but you can go visit it and you can see it for yourself and you can experience what it is like, in my opinion, to have a property and a home that speaks to its environment well. So I think on the one hand, it's individual, but on the other hand, communally, like societally, you have neighborhoods like Coconut Grove, where when developers come in and they have all the money and all the backing in the world, the people cause a stir and they make petitions and they say, you can't tear this down. And they go to their commissioners and they say, hey, you need to get behind this. This is historically important to our neighborhood. And they're successful a lot of the time. Sometimes it can be, I don't want to say it's a bad thing, but sometimes it's harmful because there are sometimes buildings that for whatever reason, no longer benefit the people that
Are in the
they once
community.
did, that are the community. So maybe there is a better use for a particular piece of land, but a lot of times we need those people groups to speak up and defend, because the buildings can't speak for themselves, but it's
Yeah.
the communities and the activists that can speak for the buildings and speak for the environment. I think that happens a lot today, especially in the grow of communities like Miami Beach, that leads to designations of communities so that they're deemed historical, so that legally they either can't be torn down or you have to go through incredible rigor to get to a point where you can do anything remotely close to redeveloping. So I think at two levels, those are some ways that it can be accomplished.
Okay, so we're actually nearing the end of the episode, but before we go, I want to ask you, are there any books, or can you give me 2 books that you would recommend to someone if they want to, if they just want to learn more about the environment, or if they want to design with the environment in mind?
Sure. I actually struggled to find books that spoke to my feelings on the subject,
Okay.
but I did find 2.
Okay.
And I was actually talking with a friend yesterday about how fitting it is that the 2 books that I enjoyed about this topic are not really traditional literature. So the first is a book called Architecture Without Architects.
Okay.
And it is a book, and it was written from a MoMA exhibit. And it's about this non-pedigreed architecture that often gets tagged as primitive or overlooked because there's no traditional formal architectural style attributed to it or individual architect attributed to the work. But there is a sense of place that these architectures have when you look through the photos of the book and you read the writings, that is clear that these people groups understood how to live in their environments without the professional world enforcing some academic or manifesto approach to design. So I think that book in particular, I've always enjoyed the topic and the way that it talks about this, for lack of a better word, like informal architecture. I don't think informal is the right word, because I think that's just our view of it, because we have this view of what formal architecture is. But the other words that people use are vernacular,
yes,
anonymous. But I honestly believe it's more than that. It's literally been given that position just because of how history's been recorded. Like, we know who Agrippa is because of the Roman Empire and because of the Pantheon. But we don't know who built these structures. It doesn't mean that they were non-notable people.
That's so true.
So that's the first one. The second one is ironically about an individual, but it's Peter Zumthor's Atmospheres.
Okay.
The cover is very nondescript, and actually it's a book that is a lecture he gave about his approach to design. And his work, I would argue, fits into this world of understanding people in place very well. His art, I've never been to any of his buildings, but just from photos and readings, it's clear to me that he has a deep understanding of who he's building for and where he's building. His buildings are moving in that way. And he attributes this sense of movement and atmosphere. He likes it to music, how as individuals, whether we're musicians or not, most people are moved by music. And in a particular way that we may not be able to put words to, but there is an emotion that comes along with certain musical styles for different people. And I think he attributes that he tries to access that deep feeling about architecture through his work. And I think from reading his book, that's deeply tied to this concept of having this environmental intuition, the environment being both a people and a place.
Very nice. Thank you for sharing those two books. I'm going to order them right after this session, actually.
Cool.
And
I hope they're still in print. I think this one is still in print. I'm not sure if this one is, but I'm sure you can find it used somewhere.
Yeah, I'm gonna look around. Well, thank you so much for joining me on this call.
Of course, I'm so glad to have been on it.
Oh, thank you. So we're going to move on to the questions now.
Okay.
Let's see. Let me see. Okay, so we have a question. Did the diversity of professors pose a problem for you with so many different styles of design and designs influencing you?
It's a good question. So for me in particular, I would say no, because what I was able to take from it was how different architecture can speak to different people. So it gave me a broader view of architecture. The fact that people could come at a particular project from so many different directions based on where they went to school and where they grew up and the styles that influenced them versus other people. And at the same time, at least with the University of Miami, when you become an upper level student, I think 4th year, you can start to select your design courses. So your first 3 years, there's this path that's set for you. And then within that path, you have all these different faculty members who have different ways of teaching, but it's really one design objective. And then from there, the faculty members individually get to pose a particular studio that you can select from. So as a student, you can say, okay, well, I think this is more of what I'm interested in. Let me see. And so you have so many more options. Like people can, UM used to have this, they used to just be the classical school. You'd go there to learn how to design things classically. You can still graduate from UM, at least when I graduated, with like a heavy classical style of education. And at the same time, you can leave with this very spatially oriented idea of design, form-based, like it's across the board. And I really loved that aspect of it. Like my last class actually at University of Miami was all coding in Python.
Oh, wow.
And it was iterative design. And I loved it. It was fantastic. But it just shows you, that can be your last design in school, or you could be, drawing Doric columns from Vignola, like trying to get the ratios all right. And, you could be really anywhere.
In the spec.
Yeah.
Okay, so there's a comment in the section in the chat from Craig, actually. So he says, "Hi, hey Andrew, it's good listening to you. I've wanted to meet you for some time. Let's make it happen sometime soon." And he has his email there.
Yeah, for sure.
Well, if no one else has any questions, I just want to, first of all, before we wrap up, the first thing is we will be having our next live episode on this month on the 25th. And then we actually opened up the Layers of Design podcast shop. So the graphics, some of our favorite graphics from each Sketch It Out episode, we have gone ahead to put them on sketchbooks and as well as espresso mugs. So if you're interested, you can head over to layersofdesign.online and just head over to the shop to check out the different designs that we have. But lastly, I just want to say again, a big thank you to everyone who tuned in. And thank you so much to Andrew for joining us today and just sharing with us his experience. It's been great.
Thank you.
Of course. Well, have a great Sunday, everyone.